Welcome to Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes Ministries. Thank you for listening. Janet will be talking about her struggle with addiction, alcohol, drugs, eating disorders, unwanted same-sex attraction, and living a homosexual life. Janet has survived all those things by the grace of God. Janet's not a doctor, she's not a therapist, she's not a psychotherapist, she's not a licensed counselor. Janet is an ordained pastor and wants to show you God's promises, how God has set her free, and how you can be set free. What He has done for her, He will do it for you. If healing and freedom are what you want, you have come to the right place at the right time. Let's get started. Here is Janet Boynes.
I'm so excited to have Dr. Christopher Rosik with me today. Dr. Rosik, welcome to Healing and Made Free.
Well, thank you, Janet.
It's an honor to have you. You know, we're on some emails together, and I always read whatever you send. I thought, man, this guy is really interesting. I just want to read just a little bit of your bio that I pulled off the internet. It says you are a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Oregon, earned
We call
his
it
doctorate.
Oregon up there. Yeah, that's
Or what do you call it? Or who?
Oregon up in Eugene, where the school is.
All depends where you're from, you know, the Midwest.
That's right. I did my
earned his doctorate in clinical psychology from Fuller Graduate School of Psychology.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
You have a few professional interests.
I do. They've kind of evolved over time, but yeah, I have a few.
Yeah. Well, what are some of your interests?
Oh, goodness. I really got started after I graduated in looking at what is now called complex PTSD, trauma dissociation. That really, I had a number of clients whose presenting symptoms really made sense in light of that, what was being discovered about dissociation and PTSD. And so I kind of immersed myself in that for a number of years. But it did evolve over time into what I think we're going to be talking about today more, as far as the care of like unwanted same-sex attraction, gender incongruity, that kind of thing. So I can tell you how that came about if you want.
Yes. But before we do that, did something happen in your childhood life that caused you to want to become a psychologist or get your doctorate in what we're going to discuss about homosexuality today?
Yeah, there were a few things. I had some exposure to some basically Christian-oriented psychologists back in the day. And then, of course, there was the Bob Newhart show, which, I jokingly say, man, I want to become a psychologist so I can have a wife like Bob Newhart had, right? So I kid about that. But and Bob Newhart did not exhibit really good ethics. I don't practice like he did. But anyway, that's a little joke about it. But yeah, there were some influences in my life that made it interesting to me. I almost declared as a journalist because U of O had a good journalism school too at the time. And but looking back, I'm kind of glad I went into psychology. Probably because I really enjoyed the things I liked the most were basically philosophy and kind of religion, spiritual issues, and psychology really it's a soft science. I mean, there is science to it, but it's also very much dealing with these deep human issues, and philosophy and faith and those sorts of things come into play. So it's kind of a practical way to earn a living and yet be able to engage with people about some of those issues some of the time.
Yeah. Before we get into the other questions I have for you, many times I know I do, we have loved ones that are in the life of homosexuality. Your family, knowing that, you have your doctorate in psychology, is that something that is a difficult subject around the table because of your knowledge, or do they talk with you about it, or?
The topic of homosexuality, particularly?
Yes.
They tend to know that I have engaged in these sorts of discussions in the research and things, and some of the family, may ask me about it. Some doesn't. I don't purposely like bring it up all the time or anything like that. If someone asks, I will give my thoughts and my experiences, and I'm happy to do that. So yeah, you want to be knowledgeable, but not push people where they don't want to be pushed, right? And family relationships are too important to risk in a sense. But like I say, I'm not afraid to talk about it.
Right. Christopher, the Supreme Court sided with Washington law banning Christian counseling for LGBT issues for minors. That just happened.
Right.
Can you talk about that a little bit and the impact that is having on Christian counselors, even such as yourself?
Well, excuse me. I'm from the state that had the first law against treatment of minors in a way that could be construed as I'm going to get this thing off my screen. Yeah. In a way that could be construed as promoting change. So I dealt with it even back then, being in this state. Um, I would say, in terms of how it's affecting counselors, I really do think that it's, despite what's sometimes claimed, there are not many, if any, counselors, licensed therapists out there practicing the way they're accused of practicing. If that were the case, you'd find, I think, scores of people losing their licenses, and that would make the headlines. You could for sure, and that's just not happening. It hasn't happened in the 10 years that these laws have been on the books in many states. Mm-hmm. So my impression is that this is much more about intimidating therapists to not work with, not even dabble in these things, not do anything that could be construed as quote unquote non-affirming with a client. And so I think it has a kind of chilling effect, and that may be the desire, that therapists are just not going to touch these people. Not going to say, I can't help you even explore your sexuality in a way that might be construed as change. I'm not going to risk my license or something like that. And so one of the potential side effects is that, and I say this, that people with unwanted same-sex attraction who really want to go and explore that with a therapist are going to be scared away because of that, or the therapist is going to say, I can't help you. And so they will go to their perhaps, certainly unregulated religious counselors. And I always say there's a lot of good pastoral care out there for these individuals. I appreciate that. But there's a lot more variability, right? And so there are some instances where I think people have been hurt in ways by unknowledgeable approaches to unwanted same-sex attraction. And so in some sense, these laws are going to push people more into risk of harm than actually spare them from harm.
Right, that's good.
And that's one of the reasons actually why I think in the long run, there is a desire by the activists to really find a way to prevent even religious counselors, pastors, and all that from, exploring the possibilities of change for a person coming to them with, on their own accord with unwanted same-sex attractions.
The ban that happened in Washington, was that the ban only towards youth, or was it towards anybody that is looking for help that is dealing with homosexuality? Because what that tells me is that they would rather them go to a secular counselor that's going to encourage them that they were born that way and stay into homosexuality and push us Christians away, because they know deep down that we would be able to assist them and help them. So my question is the ban just for youth under 18? Is that for anybody?
Right now it is for youth. That's what's been able to stick so far. I think, at least among some, the desire would be to ban it for any adult, whether it's a religious or a mental health practitioner. There was a law in California that was really a kind of a miraculous thing that it didn't pass. It was all teed up to be signed by the governor, and it didn't happen. For a lot of prayer, actually, and some work by several pastors and things. But anyway, it's a law that uses consumer protection, existing laws, and so that if they could get a law like that, that would cover any kind of care where there's a fiduciary interaction, it wouldn't be limited just to licensed mental health people. It would be pastor, religious counselors. There was some debate whether or not if someone tied to the church, whether that would constitute a fiduciary relationship with their pastor, and hence kick the laws in there if they wanted to change, if they changed their mind about their sexuality and then decided they were going to sue their pastor or their church. So these laws are sort of invitations to sue, or at least ostensively, and that is kind of the threat value of it. We're going to just chill people. They're going to be too afraid to venture into this area.
Has Christian counselors and pastors, I'm credentialed under the Assemblies of God. I got my credentials in 2018.
Right.
Are they taking the bait? Are they saying, okay, we're not going to do counseling because we don't want to be thrown in jail or we don't want the lawsuit?
Yeah, it's a little hard to gauge that, because I think most people, even therapists that are willing to entertain a client's goal of change and explore, with them the fluidity of their sexuality, they're not going to be above the radar. They're going to do this privately.
Right.
They're not going to let other people know they do it because of the chilling effect of these things. So those who are kind of above the radar on this are limited. But my sense would be that it's certainly making people more cautious. There's some of the associations I'm involved in, people they don't want to be affiliated with them because we do talk about these questions of, how do you help someone with unwanted same-sex attractions explore their sexuality, and how you do that in a way that honors their autonomy, but obviously doesn't promise change, doesn't do sort of unethical things.
It's really sad that we're in the end of the end times, I believe, and the enemy, Satan, is out like a roaring lion seeking who he may devour, which is mainly Christians. He knows, where he'll spend eternity. And so he'll do everything he can to push us away from helping those that are living in this particular sin. Studies claim conversion therapy caused LGBT study participants to have more suicidal thoughts. Can you speak into that? They claim.
Right. And there's no doubt that, those with same-sex attractions or gender incongruence tend to have higher prevalence of sort of emotional distress, suicidality, those sorts of things. That's well established. I think what's at question is whether change efforts actually are the active ingredient in that, primarily. There has been some recent research, which is very, very interesting. I think it kind of blows up the narrative, and it's certainly a call for better research, if nothing else. But some research done by Dr. Paul Sullins, a Catholic sociologist, a friend of mine, and he basically reanalyzed a study that was done, that was in part sponsored by the Williams Institute, which is a LGB allied research tank out of UCLA. And they did a very good study. I mean, in terms of their recruitment, it was a population-based representative sample. And they published some research out of that, some of their authors, that suicide was associated with change efforts, attempting change efforts, and claimed that therefore there was this sort of harm of increased suicidality. But Dr. Sullins actually looked at this data. It was publicly available to scholars, thank goodness. And he realized that, hey, there was some questions there that they didn't look at that would allow for the researchers to understand how much suicidality these individuals had prior to, seeking change, prior to any kind of change effort. Right? And you always have to do that. That's research 101. But for some reason, that wasn't done. And when he actually controlled for the level of distress of suicidality prior to the person engaging in change efforts, he controlled for that statistically and found out that, change efforts actually either oftentimes decrease suicidality, or there was kind of a no effect. So the thinking would be that probably the proper thinking is people were very distressed and suicidal before they came into a therapy or counseling with a therapist, a counselor. And part of that may have been to explore their sexuality, but the fact that they got this care, whether or not there was change or not, they actually reduced their suicidality. So it kind of upends the narrative a little bit. And it's like I said, you can agree or disagree, but certainly what a person cannot do is certainly somebody who has the integrity of science in mind. They can't say, well, we don't need to do any research about this. Right. And then I followed that. What I did was I looked at all the recent research on change efforts and found that every single study that cited did not control for the level of distress of suicidality prior to the change effort. They just either was missed, ignored, or not considered. And so, I always say that at the very least means the information that we have, the findings we have, the narratives we have are incomplete at best. At worst, they're just completely inaccurate. So I hope there's better research that's done rather than research that's, I call it, data in search of conclusions. That is performative kind of research, which unfortunately is a lot of what's going on out there. It's funded by and conducted by individuals who have a certain ideological investment in the research, and they may be right, but they may be wrong. And unless you have meaningful critique of what you're doing, I think there's real risk that errors or omissions or outright kind of potential fraud of the kind that Dr. Sullins has been disclosed, that's going to happen.
Wow. Those of you that are listening via podcast or any other media outlet, I am talking with licensed psychologist Dr. Rosik. Dr. Rosik, homosexuality isn't the problem. It's the manifestation of what's really going on inside of a person. There's so many things that can push somebody into the life of homosexuality. Based on your knowledge, what are some of the things that causes someone to go into a life of homosexuality?
Yeah, good question. I would agree with you that I think our best understanding, and even the American Psychological Association, I think, would say that there are many pathways. There's not just one way that a person may begin to experience same-sex attraction. Right. And I always say, here's something I always say, that as a therapist, I want to understand how the client sees it first. So my question is, here's what must have happened to you. You must have had abuse or something like that. No, I say, tell me how you've come to understand this. How do you think it came about for you? I really want to understand their individual experience. And as a therapist, I don't want other therapists telling my clients how their attractions came about. I don't want the APA telling my clients how their attractions came about or couldn't have come about and what goals they can have. I don't want the government, I don't want politicians telling my clients, what you can or cannot do as an individual with your sexuality. Provided there's obviously informed consent and not over-promising change and those basic kinds of things. And to me, that just seems like common sense. But I think I may have diverted from your question just a little bit there.
No, you're doing great, because I think everything you're saying is informative. And I think my listeners need to be more knowledgeable of this issue.
Yeah.
I wanted to know what are some of the causes or reasons why people go into the life of homosexuality? We know it can be rape, abuse.
Right. Well, and keep in mind, I think the best way to think about it is there are multiple factors, right? There's just not one factor typically. I mean, you could say, obviously it's not simply genetic, right?
Right.
But genes are involved in any kind of behavior we do. So there may be an aspect of that for some people. more than for others. So I just think there are many variables involved, and they're weighted differently for different people. For some people, trauma, they experience trauma as a factor, a factor in their development of their attractions. Other people may experience, bullying and rejection and those kinds of things as a factor in how they feel about their gender or their sexuality. There are papers of where people have just, I think in a feminist mindset where lesbian was kind of a choice and more of a volitional thing, than a biological thing or a emotional psychological thing. But anyway, that's just to say I think there are lots of factors. I think you want to find out how the person, you don't want to superimpose any one particular kind of understanding onto a person, but work with them. But there are certain patterns maybe that, such as trauma, that are often worthy of exploring.
Right.
And there are certainly cases where an individual has worked and addressed their trauma, and through that they've experienced maybe some shifting in their sexuality.
Dr. Rosik, I was raped by my mother's husband, raped by an altar boy, watched my mother get abused by my stepfather. There was no way in heck I wanted to go into a heterosexual relationship because I thought that all men rape you, all men beat you up, even though I was going to get married in 1985 and called off my wedding. A lot of parents have a lot of guilt when a child of theirs go into the life of homosexuality. Sometimes it can be problematic in the home because the parent feels like it's their fault. I feel that my upbringing caused me to look for another way to medicate my pain by going into the life of homosexuality, by doing drugs. Can parents be a part? We want them to be a part of the solution, but sometimes are parents part of the problem that causes a child to want to go into the life of homosexuality, meaning that a girl is not getting enough love and attention from her mom or a son. Dad's on the road all the time. He's spending a lot of time with, Aunt Mimi and, Sister Mary, et cetera, et cetera. How do you answer that?
Well, again, I go back to, I think there are probably multiple factors. So I wouldn't want the parent to take blame for
full
everything.
Responsibility.
It's
right.
always good to look at look at how I related to my child and ways I could perhaps improve that going forward. Right. But I don't think in the end, it's not helpful for the child just to beat myself up. There may be some changes that would be beneficial to the relationship. And certainly if I look back as a parent and see that maybe there's been some abuses or some neglect or things, and if I can just own that to the child, I think that's very helpful. When I work with parents, I obviously tell them, you need to love your child, even if they have come out or something like that, because you want to keep the lines of communication open as much as possible. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily compromise your, theological views, perhaps, but you do have to love your child as much as possible, because it may be that they, not a guarantee, but it may be that they find that world is not what it turned out to be, what they thought it would be for them, and that they want to perhaps explore a right relationship with you again, and maybe shifting or thinking differently about their sexuality. And so you want to make sure that line of communication is open. So yeah, I try to help parents, walk that difficult road between, staying in contact and loving their child, and yet wanting to hold on to, typically their historic kind of Christian beliefs about what is the ideal for sexual practice.
Right. I work with a lot of parents, giving them spiritual guidance. I'm not a professional counselor, nor would I try to be, but a person who's been through that life, written books, and been out of that life for 20 years. I have a general idea on, working alongside of my good friend, David Pickup. You know who David is. Sure. I tell parents that you can love your child without compromising your morals and your values,
Right,
and so to distinguish the two and how to separate. I tell them loving your child is not necessarily going to their same-sex wedding. Loving your child isn't necessarily doing what they want you to do, and supporting their ideology. And so I tell parents the first thing that should be important to them is honor God and his word, first and foremost. Love God. And when you love God, you're going to honor his word and support what the Bible says. Dr. Rosik, interesting topic. One of the number one issues we're dealing with in America. What made you interested in this particular topic?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I didn't get out of graduate school thinking this is what I was going to be doing, right? Or that I was going to be talking a lot about this. That was not on my radar at all.
Wasn't in your wheelhouse, huh?
It wasn't. Now, but what happened is I ended up, and I've worked for a number of years now at a counseling center here in Fresno, California, that works a lot with missionaries and clergy. We have kind of a program for them, intensive counseling and pastoral care program. It's a great program. And over the years, this is starting back in the 90s, one of the things I noticed was that, it wasn't the most common issue, but it wasn't uncommon that these sincere Christian workers, missionaries, pastors, one of their presenting concerns was same-sex attraction. They had that in the background, and they wanted to perhaps explore the possibilities of, aligning their behaviors and attractions more in line with their faith. And again, this was in the 90s, and with the debates even back then about same-sex marriage, and I was hearing a lot of the analogies then in that debate about you're basically equating a sexual orientation with race, and thinking to myself, well, if that's the case, this is how people are thinking. The activists are thinking that these two are equivalent. Then you wouldn't counsel someone to change their race, right? I mean, that's nonsensical. So I'm reading the tea leaves and thinking, well, goodness, if that's where it's going, I could see where there is going to be efforts to make it, hard, if not impossible, for these sincere Christian leaders to explore their sexuality. Right? So I'm not a prophet, but even back then, given the way the language was happening in these analogies that were being made around the same-sex marriage debate, I had concern that these individuals that I was working with were going to have their sort of freedoms taken away, therapeutic freedoms to explore their sexuality. And so that's when I sort of decided to start writing about things and getting interested in the topic. And, there was a time when I kind of just had a little talk with God about, do I really have to go down this road, or do you want me to go down this road? And, because once you may know this, and once you kind of get on that train with God, it's like you're not driving it anymore, and it's going where it's taking you, right? And
so
you're not really in control anymore of it. But I decided I would take that. For me, that was a leap of faith, and I haven't regretted it. I mean, it's been a very enriching ride so far. It's had its hard parts, of course, but I felt like it's the right thing. It's what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I decided in that time to I would become someone who might represent these individuals who don't have a voice within academia, generally speaking, and certainly within the scholarly literature, try to represent their experience and their interests. And so I'm sort of I guess you could say a missionary to that world in a way. But I hope it's mostly just I'm trying to be a good scholar and represent an extremely underrepresented and misunderstood group of individuals, largely, of course, within religious communities, Christian communities.
Yeah. Dr. Rosik, you mentioned color, and it's sometimes hard for me as a person of color, Black, to hear homosexuals try to tie in our color with homosexuality or slavery, because the color of our skin is an immutable, unchangeable characteristic. That I can't change, even though some people might have tried to bleach their skin and try to change from one color
Right,
to
right.
the next. However, we know people can lead the life of homosexuality. We know they weren't born that way. We know there's no scientific evidence. So we know that homosexuality is being driven from somewhere, and I believe from the enemy, the pit of hell. Let me ask you a quick question before I go on to something. This just popped in my mind.
Uh-huh.
Dr. Rosik, working in this field, as I'm 65 years old. I've been in this field for a little over 20 years, or came out of lifestyle about 20 years. I'm finding, based on statistics, that our Gen Zs is driving um, the scale going up
Mhm.
for homosexuality. Are you hearing that as well, or
Yeah, I've
seeing
heard
that?
statistics that somewhere, I don't know, 30, 40% are some kind of LGBTQ non-binary, or identifying in that way. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, I think that's pretty established, but some good polling.
Based on your knowledge, and you might not have the answer to this, why do you think that is? Are they going through trauma, or they're just following another friend, or everybody else is doing it, so they want to try it? And once they get into it, they have a hard time coming out. Do you have any recollection on why do you think this is happening?
I think there's lots of again, lots of factors. Most things are not simple, but obviously
Right.
social media, in my experience, is a big thing. Um, I've thought about this some about um, especially with the younger generation now having this increase in mental health issues across the board, and I thought about like identity. And what I see actually is that, the traditional identities that have been given to young people, like being let's see, a mother or a father or a family identity or a religious identity, a Christian identity, these things that people would build their identities tend to be around. They'd be the foundation of their identities. That those things are being sort of erased, right?
Mm-hmm.
Through family dissolution, through the growth of secularism, um, and even being an American, that used to be kind of an identity that people had. And so I actually think that one of the things this increase in mental health issues for the younger generation may signal is that it's very difficult to create your own identity ex nihilo, out of nothing, when you have nothing. You've been given no real firm foundation that we would have had in the past, of our family or our country or our faith, and these identities don't exist. So you've got this cornucopia of identities to choose from. That's a heavy burden for a young person,
Mm-hmm.
right? To
Mm-hmm.
pick out some identity when you have no other kind of foundation. Um,
Right.
and that's not the whole story, but I can see that being a part of why kids are struggling, because they're not given these identities. A lot of the kids I see, their families are, not in great shape. Too many of them, and they don't identify with it. They don't identify with their parent, or a mother or
Mm-hmm.
father. Um,
Right.
and so they see a YouTube influencer and, that looks interesting, and I'll take on that cause. Or I'll identify in this way. And so there's they're trying to create an identity, which is normal for adolescents, for instance, but they have, they're working, like I say, ex nihilo. They're trying to do it out of nothing, as opposed to where maybe people my generation would at least have a better sense of a foundation in some of these fundamental kind of identities that we would build off of.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I'm hearing that quiet that the Gen Zs and millennials are going through an identity crisis. They don't know who they are. They don't know who God has called them to be. And so I tell pastors and leaders that it's so important that, we get back to the basics of discipleship when kids are coming to church. I think back in my era growing up, when I got saved in 1980 and walked away from the Lord, of course, years later, but I had people to disciple me. and you don't see that as much as you used to. And I think that would be beneficial. All of the secular mental health associations have come against change effects. What do you think? What do you think that's going on here?
Yeah. I mean, like, I'm a member of the American Psychological Association, a couple other associations. I don't speak for them, obviously, but I know what's going on. And yes, they've come out very much opposed to any sort of change efforts, although it's broadly defined. That's one of the problems. But I think what people need to understand, I mean, when it's a non-controversial thing, a non-politically charged kind of thing, there's a lot of good research that's being done, a lot of stuff I appreciate about the APA. But when it's something that has like a controversial social issue, then what people need to understand is that these associations are reliably left of center in their interpretation of the data and their political interests, right? So I would not have a problem if the APA, when it comes to even change efforts, if the APA would just say, we represent a firm left of center take on the research. Okay, that would be honest. Yeah. But when you say, we speak for the science, that's where I pull my hair out, and you can see I don't have much left. So I've been with APA a long time about these kinds of things. But just to give you an example, one of my talking points, because I've tracked this, I've been a member of the National Association of Social Workers for, I don't know how many years now, but since 2014, I've tracked this because the NASW is one organization that actually endorses political candidates. So you can go in as a member and find out who they've endorsed. And I've just kept track of this since 2014. And the latest, I'm sure I know what's going to happen in the coming election cycle, but since 2014, in any federal elections, the NASW has made 714 endorsements of political candidates. And the ratio of Democrat to Republican endorsements in that total is 713 to 1. So 713 Democratic endorsements of Democratic candidates to one Republican over that, I don't know, multiple decade span or a long period of time. So, I mean, that's just to say, okay, that's fine, that's their right, but don't tell me you don't have a political slant in the way you're approaching things here, or a worldview slant in the way you're approaching it. Don't tell me you just represent science. No, you're not looking at it from a broad-based perspective. And so that's really what I see in my complaint about the mental health associations, is they're not being really honest about this, is that our leadership for sure is just dominated by left of center perspective, which is fine as long as you're honest about it, but don't try to say we don't, that our perspective from left of center is the only perspective and the only perspective you should make policy on, and don't listen to the other perspective.
You talk about the Secular Mental Health Association. Of course, they don't believe people can change their sexual orientation.
That's not
Does
entirely
sexual orientation change?
Jenna, that's not entirely true, actually. They would say that what they would call naturalistic change, at least the scholars involved in it, that naturalistic change happens all the time. When they do longitudinal studies of sexual orientation, behavior, attractions, identity, they find that this will, for many people, slightly more so women than men, but for many people, they do experience this fluidity and change over time, right? What they would say, however, and this is where I think the ideological blinders come into play, is that, this change can never be, what would they call it? Can never be purposeful, right? Mm-hmm. It can never be a product of human agency, right? It only happens sort of serendipitously in response to maybe a relationship change or something else. But it could never happen because a person went into therapy or went to see a counselor and explored this with them and looked at some of the factors in their environment that might have contributed as they see it, and make some changes in their life. And maybe as a byproduct of that, some they experience some change in their sexual attractions or some food. That could never happen, right? So to me, that's kind of the blind spot that I see, that the research is clear that change does happen naturalistically with, just by not trying, it can happen. But if you actually try and seek a counselor for assistance in that could never happen, right? And that's why we got to ban it.
Yeah, well, this is really good. Those of you that are listening, I'm talking with licensed psychologist Dr. Rosik. If you are watching this on YouTube or listening to on my podcast, please share this on your social media page or share it with a friend, because Dr. Rosik is so knowledgeable on this issue of homosexuality. Dr. Rosik, this is my last question. What are some of the things that you're doing research on in this particular area?
Well, like I said earlier, I mean, I have an interest in trying to represent a certain segment of the sexual minority population that I think doesn't have a voice. And those are, and typically I think we're existing within traditional religious communities. These are individuals who maybe experience same-sex attraction or gender incongruity, and yet they prioritize their faith experience over their sexual experience in terms of the foundation of their identity, and they want to live by the values of their faith. And I think many are doing that. But like most of the research that's being done is being done on individuals who identify as LGBT. So when that's a criteria of inclusion in a study, which it is for many studies, that you're excluding by definition all these individuals who maybe have had different experiences. And frankly, researchers will utilize networks and groups of people that are familiar to them and that trust them. And so since the researchers are overwhelmingly, I think, left of center, and have often, if you're researching this area, I'm kind of a outlier because that's not my background in terms of same-sex attractions and things. But oftentimes researchers in this area, that's their background, or they're definitely on a mission. Like I say, looking data in search of or a narrative in search of data. But I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. I've done that so many times. And
research. Okay, yeah.
Go ahead.
So I'm trying to represent this group that's ignored, I think, and I think as a result of their being ignored in the literature, in the scientific literature, it's again, the literature is incomplete, and policy is being made in ways that damages their interests when their experiences and their aspirations are not even being represented. And so there's a big, like I say, a blind spot there that I'm hoping I can have a little say in, and getting that out. So the scientific world can appreciate that, we've got to have a broader swath of studies to really fully comprehend the full range of people's experiences when it comes to even self-initiated change efforts.
Wow. This is good, Dr. Rosik. It's been an honor to have you on. Do you do counseling outside of the state that you live in?
Typically
Zoom
not.
or
California,
okay.
You cannot do like telehealth, mental health. If you do counseling outside of the state, in California, we don't have reciprocity. We're kind of an arrogant state, and we don't like any reciprocity. Any other state want you to come and go by our rules rather than us and try to get along with you. So in California, if I were to do, telehealth in another state, I would probably be considered doing, practicing without a license in that state, right? Because I'm licensed in California. So I know people have different, standards that they go by with that, but I'm fairly conservative in that. I think it's a bit of a risk.
Well, if someone wanted to reach out to you, Dr. Rosik, how would they reach you? Do you have an email address or something?
I suppose they could reach out. It's Christopher Rosik at linkcare.org. That's linkcare.org. probably the easiest way to do it. And Christopher Rosik without any periods in it or anything like that, 2 R's in the middle. That would be the easiest way to get a hold of me. I should say there is an organization I'm involved with as well called the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity. I have been past president there, and that they have a website. It's therapeuticchoice.com, therapeuticchoice.com, and a person could go there and get some good information. There's some other good organizations, particularly within the trans issue. A lot of organizations have sprung up around that issue. But there's decent information out there. And it's important. I have a big, to me, it's very important. Another reason I'm in here in this area is because I want to educate the church, right? I want the church to be agents of healing as well. And that means kind of being knowledgeable in this area because, people can be hurt by sometimes well-meaning, but just, actions and words that are not perhaps informed, right? Just sometimes just pray away the gay. And I'm not saying some people might have that experience, but I think that, again, my encouragement is to take it individually and get to know the person first, get to know their experience, and work within that, rather than superimpose, a system on them to, right off the bat.
Well, Dr. Rosik, this has been so good. Pastors, ministry leaders, moms, dad, you have just listened to Dr. Rosik. If you have any questions for him, please don't hesitate to reach out to him. If you can't reach him, email Janet Boynes Ministries. Many large churches, you have staff that need to hear this information. He is very knowledgeable. You won't have a problem with following him and getting the information that you need for your church. As you heard him say that, he want to get the information out to the church, and the church most definitely needs this information. Dr. Rosik, thank you so much for being on Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes.
Thank you, Janet. It's been very nice. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes. Acts 10:34 says, God is no respecter of persons. God doesn't play favorites, which means what he has done for Janet, what he has done for guests on this show, he will do for you too. If you are struggling with anything, do not hesitate to reach out to Janet Boynes Ministries. They will do their best to help you any way they can. Go to the website, janetboynesministries.com. Janet loves you, and most importantly, God loves you. Have a blessed day.